questions in chat, and let's move on now to what promises to be this great webinar. We're happy to be joined by a first-time presenter at Devops.com webinars, Tim Buntel, who is recently joined VP of Products at Lazily Labs. Tim, welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. It's really great here to be here. This is such a great topic. Just kind of quick background. As you said, I'm new to the Lazily Labs team, but have been helping people solve great problems through great software for a number of years at a bunch of different companies. Spent some time at Atlassian and Adobe and Microsoft, and even back to Macromedia and some earlier companies. And have spent the last few years in the software security space, helping developers build more secure software. So I've really kind of seen the evolution of lots of practices in how people build great software. So now focusing specifically on this DevOps area is very exciting for me, because I see it as really the evolution of how we as software professionals can bring value to users in the most efficient way. And really that's what it's all about if you build software. You know, this topic as well about metrics and about measurement, I think is also really important, because it's a way for us to demonstrate some of the impact that we have as software professionals, even when our organizations aren't software companies. And again, that's really core to why we build our products in the first place, right, is to add value to our organization. So that's what we'll talk about today. To kind of give you a kind of high-level flow of what we'll look at is, I'm going to start with this notion of metrics in general, right? Like, why would we measure things, and what's important to measure in a DevOps perspective, and what are metrics valuable for in the first place, given what we understand about DevOps. And then we'll move into kind of looking at how your collection and presentation of some of those metrics can evolve over time as your maturity evolves over time, sort of from the early stages of automation and optimization up through really becoming a digital enterprise. We're going to have lots of time available at the end for questions and comments, right? Not just questions, but I'm keen to hear thoughts and feedback. I wouldn't say this is a super controversial topic, but it's a topic that I think there's lots of different opinions about. How deeply do you go? What level of measurement and metrics are really valuable versus where you start to blur the line with overload of information, right? So keen to have that discussion with folks towards the end as well. As we said at the beginning, Lazily Labs is the company that I work for. Everything we're going to discuss today will be appropriate to organizations regardless of what tools and processes they use, but you know, I'll just briefly a little bit about us. You know, we're really an enterprise DevOps company. That's our sole focus, and we've been delivering solutions for over 5 years now for hundreds of kind of global 2,000 clients, from American Express, Apple, Nike, KLM, a long list of folks there. The thing that I do want to point out about us as an organization, to share some of these thoughts with you, is this is what we do. So DevOps is our entire focus, and helping people be successful delivering better quality software at scale is our entire focus. So you know, this is a kind of topic that sits above the specifics of tooling, but that we have a lot of experience in talking to so many different organizations over the years. So on that note, and I'll circle back at the end and put a little bit of context around our products, but really want to keep this conversation a little bit more broad. So to start then, why don't we do a quick poll? You know, we talk about DevOps a lot of times, it's having broad definitions, but let's open the quick poll to just get you to let us know how you would self-identify in terms of your DevOps program today, from, you know, really just kind of planting the seeds and starting out all the way up to a fairly well-established or you know, well-oiled machine. So once we get a few of the answers collected, I'll see some results. Great. Okay, so it looks like we've got a pretty good spread there. About a quarter of you are considered sort of in the planning phase of that's great. That means you're doing your homework now and you're starting to figure out how you can improve some of these processes in your organization. Vast majority, we say, in this kind of work in progress state. That's excellent too. That's a great time to know to kind of look to metrics, right, to be able to say, are we being successful with this, right? We're making this investment. Does it make sense for the business, the effort that we're putting in? As expected, fewer on the well-oiled machine and expert end. That's great too. I often talk to folks who have fairly mature programs, and even they can benefit by sort of thinking about what's the next phase of evaluating and measuring their programs. So that's terrific. Thanks for giving us that feedback. I'll have one or two other poll questions as we go along. So let's start kind of with this big picture idea, right? So we talk about metrics and we talk about measurement. What exactly does that mean in the context of DevOps when fundamentally, regardless of who you talk to or what you read, we always have this as the starting point, right? DevOps is a cultural transition, right? Yes, there's tooling, and yes, there are processes involved, but consistently the message that we hear from practitioners and thought leaders and folks who are in the throes of this experience is that DevOps is really about changing your organization's culture to deliver better software faster, right? So if you have a cultural thing, what does that mean for the case of metrics, right? When you start to think about the cultural aspects of a transition to DevOps, they tend to be a little bit more sort of esoteric or vague, right? It's things about how do you foster the relationship between teams so that operations and development have a better relationship that's built on trust. How do you encourage folks to go through some of these changes, and have the motivation to do that? How do you collaborate together to make those processes more efficient? These kind of fall into this cultural bucket, and traditionally it's hard to say there's a statistic or there's a number or there's something where we can climb through log files and pull out these cultural attributes. So it does leave us, as we're starting this transformation, in a bit of a challenging point, because at the end of the day, the reason organizations start to undertake this continuous delivery journey is for business results. It's not for culture necessarily, but at the end of the day, our businesses depend on being better at delivering software, right? Organizations are often found to sort of plow ahead with these large-scale transformations that can really be a significant investment, and yet find themselves halfway or more into the process without really finding a real value to it and always being able to have releasable code at the end of the day. If you're familiar with the book Leading the Transformation, Gary Groover and Tommy Mauser wrote this great short book I highly recommend that talks about the DevOps and Agile principles being applied at scale in an organization. And one of the sort of illustrations that they have in the beginning is if you take a large organization of 1,000 plus developers and you start adding all of the costs that come even to get you started in moving towards a more agile process, employing DevOps to deliver your software, you quickly rank into potentially millions of dollars of effort. Not to mention the sort of cultural shift and price that goes along with uncertainty and organizational change and chaos that comes there. So if we start by this statement of saying it's hard to measure this stuff, but we're asking our organizations to invest significant money, that's a difficult position. We don't want to come to this spot where we say, oh, we're going to be better and we're going to have some sort of a big objective that isn't tied to something. What exactly does better mean, and how do we demonstrate the business value of that when it comes to better quality, better speed, or business impact? We had our DevOps Leadership Summit last month in Amsterdam. The wonderful Dave Farley was there. He probably wouldn't like me showing this picture, but this is from that presentation. But we spoke to him and asked, where do you start? Like, how do you know if you're having impact, right? What do you look at? What do you measure? And one of Dave's points was, well, if you focus on just that cycle time, just focus on bringing down your cycle time when it comes to making software, the rest will, kind of, quote, naturally follow of its own accord, right? It's a laser focus on this one aspect of it that will permeate. Now, it's a really great approach to the problem, and I think he has a great point in allowing you to really think about what drives the overall transformation process, right? But this notion of focus on one thing and the rest will follow, that gets a little harder when you have to go to the boardroom, right? So it's reporting to the board that you're asking to make these multi-million-dollar investments and large organizational transformations. It's hard to say, oh, don't worry, the rest will follow, right? You need to have some sort of evidence on which you're going to propose the investment and then evaluate the outcomes, right? That's what kind of leads us to this quest for metrics, right, or measurements or statistics, right? Now, of course, statistics are challenging, right? You have to be careful with metrics. They're powerful when they're used well, but they can be really meaningless too. Love this quote from Andrew Lang, who was this 19th century novelist and literary critic. He had this statement. He said, he uses statistics the way a drunk uses a lamppost for support, not illumination, right? So this is the trap we have to watch out for. Statistics and KPIs and all of the metrics on which organizations like to evaluate and measure themselves can often be sort of twisted and presented in ways that that really don't illuminate, right? That don't lead to better improvements or furthering the improvements or transformation that you're going into. So what I'd like to do here is we'll transition now to talking about, all right, what do you gather, what do you publish to get away from this problem, to really push us as organizations and teams that are undergoing these transformations to find illumination through the numbers that get produced or the measures that we can look at for our work, okay? So quick pause there then to ask you, what do you do today, right? So do you currently have a practice for publishing metrics and gathering and sharing that about the process that you are undergoing? If you're early in the process, I know a good percentage of you were still in the planning phase, don't worry about this question. You wouldn't have anything to measure. But those of you who are underway here, do you do any of these approaches for publishing metrics about your process today? So hold on one sec. Great. Okay, so a bit of a mix here. The majority are saying, over 35% are saying, no, we don't really publish any metrics about our DevOps process. And then the next category are a little bit of sort of ad hoc, on request kind of metrics, and then down to under 30% are doing some automated metrics or dashboards, right? Small percent are doing some external tools. I have to say, these numbers are actually right in line with what I see when I'm out there talking to organizations. Often we focus on the work that's at hand of making the processes and building the changes to our software development process, but we get kind of focused on that process and aren't thinking about how do we know if it's going to be successful or not. Then what happens is a manager comes in or an executive comes in and say, hey, you've been at this DevOps thing for 2 release cycles now or 6 months or whatever the case is. How's it going, right? And then we find ourselves kind of scrambling to say, well, geez, what do we have that can tell that story in a more scientific way than just a kind of thumb in the air guide? And in many cases, a challenge to that reporting is that it's a process, right? So how do you evaluate your overall, view of the impact that it's having if you're constantly changing and improving this process? So things that are moving targets are often difficult to pin down with specific measures. So let's move past this poll then, and we'll start to talk about some actual specifics that you can measure so that when you get those ad hoc questions, you can respond to them, and then even start to talk about some ways that you might be able to gather those through some tooling to help you have them always available and published for folks to consume. There we go. So I'm going to talk about it in kind of two phases, and this is a bit of how we tend to talk to our customers and see folks self-describe the transformations that they go through for DevOps. It really kind of boils down to these two major phases, right? So phase one is where you're being good at the process of software delivery, right? Delivering quality software at scale in a highly efficient manner. Is really kind of that first step, right? This is what starts off with continuous integration, goes up through continuous delivery, and all of the process improvements that go in between. Cultural stuff is absolutely there because those are the drivers that support that transformation. But it's really, at the end of the day, about automation and optimization of processes. The good news there is, when we get to it, that's a little bit easier to measure, right? Because you're talking about actual kind of stuff that's happening. The second phase is, for me, the really important part of DevOps and continuous delivery. And that's when you realize that this is all supporting this notion of the digital enterprise, right? So what's the digital enterprise? Well, that's where software is central to your business, even if software isn't your business, right? Which is essentially where I think most organizations in the world today are finding themselves. Great example would be a bank or a financial institution, right? So when was the last time you personally went physically into a bank building to conduct the business with that bank, right? It's probably, for the majority of you, not very frequently. Generally, what makes that banking or financial institution is software, right? You interact with them as a customer through your mobile app or your online banking. They manage their processes behind the scenes through software processes, right? So the business of that financial institution is only going to be successful if the software is successful. So they're not a software company, but software makes them viable and exist as an enterprise. If you took the software away, they go away. That's the digital enterprise, right? And ultimately, when you become one of these digital enterprises, the cycle time reduction that we talk about in the first phase, it really is unimportant if nobody ultimately cares about the experience, right? Nobody actually cares about what gets made at the end of the day, and that we as the software professionals can't react to that feedback to improve the software. So those are kind of the two phases, and what I'd like you to do is kind of imagine a dashboard for each of those, right? So if you are in this first phase and you're thinking about that automation and optimization phase, there's going to be what I'll call the DevOps dashboard, right? So these are certain metrics that you can measure that are going to give you certain insight into how are you improving on that side of the process. Then the second part that I want you to imagine is what we'll call the digital enterprise dashboard, where there are certain metrics that you can look at as well that are going to help you illuminate what's happening on that other part. Is your business actually achieving its value through the use of good software? Now, is this an actual real dashboard or not? It's going to depend on your organization, where your data is coming from, how you gather it in statistics. There's lots of great solutions in the world in tooling that provide some of this data. Our products do have dashboarding and sort of data analytics and reporting as a really primary focus of our products. But there's lots of ways to do this. So I'm not going to give you demos of a specific dashboard, but we'll kind of talk to it as what would those dials and what would those charts be on your own dashboard. And then at the end, I'll mention our products, and sort of how we fit in that. So let's start with this DevOps dashboard. So this is, you're in the process of saying, how do we move from our current process from development through live software? And what are the good measurements to know, are we making improvements there? So lots have been written in this area about what to measure for those kinds of things. With statistics, an important fact is the balance, right? There's a balance between too many and too few inputs, right? My apologies to Dave Farley, but I kind of think that focusing just on one thing might be too restrictive. whereas you can absolutely get to the point of data fatigue if you have too many. So I'm going to suggest these 5, and we're going to drill into each of them. But talking about the time that's required to move software, the frequency with which you move your software through the process, the volume of changes, what's actually in the release, and then 2 other factors: what's your success rate, and in the cases when you do have problems, how quickly can you respond to and recover from those problems. For me, if you have a dashboard that has these 5 dials on it, or these 5 charts, you're going to get a pretty good picture of, over time, are you improving, and more importantly, where are your problem areas that you might want to focus on for improvement in the future. Right? So let's drill into each of these. So time to delivery is a great quote here, the tweet that I pulled from James Wickett, who was the creator of Gauntlet, software security testing product in DevOps. I said I came from that security world, but I think this is a great point, is to say, the time and impact, to take a single line of code change all the way through your process is a great place to start with looking at your transformation, right? So from the time I take the code from development complete, right, so it's handed off from the developer, all the way through the process to 100% deployed and upgraded in production, gives you this kind of time to delivery metric, okay? What does this kind of tell you? Well, it's going to tell you where are the efficiencies in your process, right, and at what stage specifically, right? So it's helpful to understand, am I getting faster? Right, so you want to see your time to delivery decreasing. If you're optimizing that process, it would be a reasonable expectation that that would decrease. But more importantly, this comes where the illumination aspect comes in, is if there are inefficiencies, where are the inefficiencies, right? So you can look at the time to delivery across each of your phases. So maybe in QA, you're having a longer delay, and moving into production or moving into final UAT or other phases are quicker. So that gives you a great tool as the sort of leader of the DevOps transformation to say, hey, let's prioritize what we go after for the phases where we have the most inefficiencies. Those of you who said you're kind of in the planning stage, the great guidance that comes for DevOps transformations is don't try to do everything at once. Pick the few areas where you have inefficiencies and focus on automating or improving those. Looking at your time to delivery across all of the phases in your development process is a great tool to help you identify which of those stages you should tackle first. Okay. Now, in addition to kind of the time that elapses as you go through, you have to think about how frequently are you deploying, right? So 451 Research did a study a couple of years back, just asking companies, would you benefit from deploying more frequently than you do today? And for the most part, at both ends of the spectrum, in the larger enterprises and the smaller companies, overwhelming response was, yeah, we want to ship software more frequently. The one place where you got a little bit more of a lopsided response is in that kind of medium enterprise size, and that might be because their ability to take advantage of frequent change gets a little trickier in some of those organizations, rolling them out. But as a general rule, thinking about delivering software more frequently is very important, because ultimately you're getting feedback sooner, right? So rather than waiting 6 months to discover whether benefit came from the work you're doing, you want to find that out as soon as possible. So what are you measuring here? Well, you're measuring how often do you release. Are you releasing several times a year? Are you measuring, daily, hourly, weekly, whatever, right? This is going to tell you, are your batch sizes appropriate to get that kind of feedback, right? If it takes you a very, very long time and you're deploying less frequently, then that means you're going to be less able to respond. So perhaps that suggests to you need to rethink the batch sizes that you're delivering, right? Automation process is also going to help you with this. If you look at the overall balance of which of my processes are automated and which of my processes are manual, then you can further target ways that you can bring the time down and increase that frequency by automation. Okay. So we now have some measures that are suggesting to us where are the bottlenecks that are causing us to ship our software less frequently, and that's making the actual process take longer. Well, the kind of next step would be to say, well, what is it that we're actually releasing, right? So releasing frequently is only important if what you're releasing is valuable, right? So thinking about what's the volume of changes that are in the releases is a really important metric to bring into the conversation. So if you have on your dashboard, what's my change volume? Now, this gets a little tricky from the what do you actually measure? So the expression of the volume of change is going to depend largely on how you represent change within your own software process. Lots of agile organizations use a common measurement like user stories or points as a way to represent the size of pieces of their software. Right? The complexity of the changes also come into play based on those measurements. So if that happens to be something that your teams use, then that would be really important to measure as well. So for each release, look at the number of story points that are deployed as part of that release, so that you're making sure that not only are you releasing frequently in small batch sizes, but is the volume of change that's in those releases meaningful as well. Lines of code, I've heard that mentioned as a potential measure of change volume. I've always been somewhat skeptical about lines of code as a representation of much of anything except lines of code. If you are releasing one change that's one line of code, but it's a very elegant line of code that represents a major change, well, that's going to have more impact in reality. So really thinking about the volume of change in terms of the complexity and the expression of that in terms of your user stories might be better. But if in your organization you're looking at legacy products, for example, and you're really saying, look, we have lots of changes to make in our existing code base, lines of code or the modified lines of code might be a really good meaningful metric for you, as long as you're tying it back to the time that it takes to get that change into production and the frequency with which you can do it. Right? So kind of next, all right, we have some changes that are meaningful. We've quickly and frequently gotten them into production. Well, is it going to work when you get there, right? So a lot of folks who talk about metrics will say failure rate, right? So what's measuring the percentage of failures? I would suggest, for psychological reasons, to call it the success rate. So rather than saying we had 5% failures, I think it's more helpful to say 95% successes. Obviously, it's a semantic issue, but these kinds of things are meaningful, especially if you have a big visible dashboard hanging in your office. I'd rather see 95% than 5% and focus on failures. But really what you're looking at here is it's important to get your releases and changes into production, but if they result in an outage, it's important for you to know that happened, right? Because that's going to tell you whether there's quality in both your code and your process, right? Most specifically, what we see when we talk to organizations with the DevOps transformation, if you're finding a lot of failed deployments, it probably suggests that you have a problem with configuration drift, right? So this is well, it worked fine in environment A, we deployed it to environment B, and suddenly it's not working, right? So something happened in the environment there that was a change that resulted in a failure, right? Understanding that that's happening can help you in your DevOps process to say, well, maybe we need better tooling or we need better processes around the provisioning and configuration of our environments to make sure that we don't have drift happening. Okay, so looking at this together with change volume, it can be really important, right? So if your change volume is low, but your percentage of failed deployments is going up, then you probably have some dysfunction there somewhere, right? So you can publish this statistic as a percentage of success, but what you're really looking for are what are the times where the deployment to production really resulted in a failure. Then finally, there will be problems with things in production. Things will break, right? That's not inherently a problem, but what is a problem is if you fail to respond to it quickly, right? So there is some bit of debate, do you measure mean time to recovery or mean time between failures, right? So Mtbf versus Mttr, it's a pretty interesting debate. My preference for the vast majority of organizations that I work with is to focus on time to recovery, right? Because faster delivery, being more agile, opens up more opportunity to failures, but they're not inherently bad. What's important is, can you react to them? Can you roll back? Can you respond? Can you take the evidence that comes out of that event and prevent it in the future, right? So I would rather, for most organizations, go with a large number of releases with some failures but quick recovery time, rather than a smaller number of releases with no failures at all. Okay. Now, that is only, of course, for certain kinds of organizations. If you have a very low tolerance for failures, then obviously focusing on mean time between failure becomes a more important metric for you, because your tolerance for problems is so high that even your ability to recover from them has to be adjusted. So that's kind of my guidance on this tile or knob in the dashboard, if you will. If you're able to have a bit of tolerance for failure, as long as you have a quick recovery, focus on that time to recovery. Make that smaller and smaller every time, so that when the inevitable problems do occur, you can bounce back quickly. However, if you have a significantly different risk tolerance, then change that around and look at mean time between failure, or maybe both at the same time. Okay, so those are kind of my knobs that are going to, the charts or the dials that are going to appear on my DevOps dashboard, looking at the optimization and process stuff. Now, how do you measure those? Well, it's going to be based on, largely on tools. It depends on the tools that you use. Certain offerings in the market can sit above this process and monitor a lot of these things. Depending on your tooling, you may have to gather a lot of this individually and from different tools, and collect those data points yourself, right? Ultimately, the more you automate and the more you use tools to do these processes, the easier it will be to report on them, because either the tools will have built-in reporting capabilities that you can aggregate, or they will at least produce log information or other system data that you can analyze to come up with these numbers, right? If you're depending largely on manual processes, you're going to have to largely depend on manual recording to be able to assess some of these metrics. So that's the guidance there. The more you automate, the more you rely on tools, the better position you'll be in to quickly extract the numbers that you need to produce these metrics measurements. Okay? So let's move on.
Tim, this is Alan. Before moving on, a quick reminder to the audience, there's some great content in here. If you do have questions, guys, please don't wait and type them in at the end, because we're coming up. We've got maybe another 15 minutes. Type your questions in now so we can get them in queue, and it just makes for a smoother operation. So if you have a question, please put it in there. Tim, sorry to interrupt. Go right ahead.
No, that's great, and I do encourage everyone. Really, this is. I'm hoping this can spark some thoughts and some conversation. So please do take advantage of those questions, and that's why we have the time. So now, imagine we've gone through this kind of first phase, and we've really focused on the optimization and the automation. Well, at the end of that process, as we talked at the beginning about this notion of the digital enterprise, the time to delivery certainly is important as a part of that process, but really what becomes important is the time to value, right? So from the moment you have an idea that says our organization's value can be better expressed to our customers through a piece of functionality and software, until they can actually get that value and then respond to it, that's really the important part, right? So for this kind of digital enterprise dashboard, it's kind of one of the tiered models here, where you really want to measure everything that was in that DevOps dashboard, but you're going to have a few more tiles on that dashboard. You're going to have a few more charts. And the ones that I'm going to propose are going to fall into these categories, right? So looking at the adoption, right? So are your changes actually being used? We're going to look at this thing called happiness, right, which is kind of vague and scary when it comes to thinking about software that I'm building. We live in the world of kind of ones and zeros, and thinking about this fuzzy thing called happiness or consumer contentment can be really challenging to us. What do you measure there? And then there's the business impact and the cultural impact, which are really at the heart of kind of making the case for the DevOps transformation that you're doing. So let's drill right into these. So, when we talk about this issue of, was it worthwhile, right? Has that change had value? We did a webinar with Kurt Bittner over from Forrester Research last year or earlier this year that had this really shocking statistic for me based on some research that had been done on sort of large-scale studies of long-term team outcomes from the value of ideas, right? And they found that of all of the ideas that were being acted upon in organizations, a third had no impact on desired outcomes at all. Right? So we started off thinking, hey, I have this idea, it's going to have a desired outcome. A third of them just completely missed the mark. A third, and this is probably the worst one, actually made outcomes worse. So we put together this idea, and at the end of the day, not only did it not help and have the desired outcome, but it actually regressed, right, in terms of the value, right? So the end of all of this was that only a third actually served to improve the outcomes that were hoped for at the beginning of it. So really, it boils down to 2/3 of what was getting built was either just total waste or potentially waste with an even worse outcome, right? So this to me says we really have to make sure that we're not just getting good at shipping and delivering software, but we really have to understand, is it having an impact so that we can respond to it and improve that value, so that improved outcomes grows from 1/3 to 2/3 to 95 to 100%, right? We're not always going to be able to have that with every idea, but the value is once we've created this well-oiled machine to go from code to delivery, well, let's take advantage of that to close that feedback cycle so that we can make sure that we're building on that and making them better. Okay, so what do we measure then? What are the things that we can look at for metrics? So the first one will be adoption and use, right? This idea that everybody wants to use this thing. There's lots of utility in what you're building. Number of ways that you can measure this. So the most obvious is kind of traffic, right? Are people actually coming to use your product? Obviously, it's going to depend on what kind of software, what kind of product you're building. SaaS or web delivered is really quite easy to build in metrics and analytics today. But then if you're delivering on-prem software, that's also still possible through some sort of tooling in product, some mechanisms by which you can gather usability or use statistics, and then either through an opt-in or by request to your customers have them send that information back to you. So traffic and utility of the application is important. I would suggest don't forget calls to your APIs can also be a good indicator of adoption and use. A lot of us are building software that isn't just measurable by Google Analytics, right? So we have to think about how many calls are being made to the systems that run our software. And if you have software that is a little harder to do tooling, looking at calls to your backend APIs might be an easier thing to measure, and certainly is easier to gather the statistics for it. So look at the traffic of the calls to the APIs. Then you also get to some other adoption and use around things like maybe user signups if it's a commercial product, right? I would also suggest that your performance and response times can give you a good indicator of this, right? So if you're using a New Relic or another product that's looking at the performance of your application, that's indicative of load, and load implies usage, right? So if you're seeing very low load, but you think that there should be considerably more based on your design of the software, maybe that means it's just not getting used, right? So these are the kinds of metrics that could be combined with your continuous delivery dashboard. So for example, if you look at your continuous delivery dashboard where we're looking at our release frequency, right, so we know the cadence of our releases, correlate that with your Google Analytics data, right? So we know that we shipped version 1 on April 1st, we know we shipped version 2 on April 15th, and version 3 on April 30th. All right, let's look at the Google Analytics data that comes in for the 2 weeks after each of those releases to measure the relative impact on traffic that those changes might have had, right? We want to see that the frequency of those releases are also resulting in increased participation from your users. It's going to tell you if it's being used and give you some insight into improving the outcomes. Okay, so that's probably the easiest. Getting a little harder, happiness, right? Are your users happy? Are they satisfied with what you're doing? It's one thing if they're using it, but they're pounding their fists against the wall. So this idea of, how can you create this understanding of happiness? It starts to get a little harder, but there are metrics there. So a great one, and probably the most obvious, are things like support ticket volume. So if you have a DevOps transformation and you're not including your support team, you're missing a really valuable piece of key feedback, which is, are the users being successful with the changes that you're delivering into production? Right? So if you're using Zendesk or using some other tool, integrate those statistics and those numbers into your continuous delivery dashboard as well. But there are other ways that you can put a barometer on happiness. Public feedback, so there's great tools out there that can look at Twitter or Facebook or other social media feeds to give you consumer sentiment or user sentiment if you have a publicly facing product. Use those metrics to integrate into your DevOps. So knowing that a release resulted in a spike of angry consumer complaints on Twitter, it's going to give you some good feedback on that. Quantitative, probably the most common is a kind of a Net Promoter Score. That's a good indicator in general of the overall satisfaction with your product. I do encourage you to think about that as part of your DevOps transformation as well. And probably the last most important one is the personal input. You measure it by asking the people. There are some great products that do this. Intercom is an example of one that's great for SaaS products or other web-based products where you can actually measure what folks are doing in your product, but then you can reach out and you can communicate with them. You can chat with them in real time and say, hey, how did you like that? Or even just give them a quick thumbs up, thumbs down on a new function. That's a great way to measure if you're rolling out features in sort of A/B testing or other rolling release scenarios where you want to check your customers' feedback. And ultimately, you can just always pick up the phone and you can ask them, right? So it's really about, are your customers being successful with what you've given them? That would be the challenges with the support tickets would measure, but also, is the change delivering value to the customers? Now I'll pause right here. A lot of people say to me at this point, well, Tim, that's the realm of product managers, right? So product managers, yeah, they're the ones that have to be out there measuring sentiment of our users. Absolutely. But remember, DevOps involves everyone. So product manager is as significant a driver of meaningful metrics for the rest of the DevOps-oriented team as somebody who's in operations looking at server uptime or a drift between failures, right? So it's just as important to take that feedback into the process so that you can improve the features that you're now able to ship faster. Right? Business impact, again, totally depends on your business, but there are metrics out there. So if somebody comes to you and says, we want to invest in DevOps, but we don't know if it's going to actually impact things, sure, you can absolutely tie that to the things that you're likely already measuring. So it could be conversions, it could be churn, it could be what the market is saying about you, or other key performance indicators. The key here is you and the DevOps, the team that's doing the DevOps transformation, you want to correlate what you're doing with some of these metrics that exist outside of your traditional organization or the things you usually control. So you can say, hey, by releasing more software at scale, at more frequent intervals, that's really had a change in our trial conversions compared to where we were when we had longer or less frequent releases, right? So this is important to say, are we becoming that kind of digitally driven enterprise where the software is your business even when your business isn't software, right? As I kind of stated here, right? So add those into your dashboard or add those into your metrics as well. Now the last one, Probably a little bit controversial here, but how do you measure the cultural impact of it, right? This gets really hard because there's not a lot of metrics that are tied to culture. I would say things like staff turnover might be a good indicator to say, are you having some benefit from the transformation? So people who build software are passionate about building great software and solving problems. If you're frustrated by your organization's inability to actually deliver great software and solve real problems, it may not be a place where you want to find yourself working, right? So a reduction in turnover might indicate that your culture is improving and people want to be part of that team. When it comes to morale too, I often encourage people, don't forget to just do surveys, right? There's a lot that you can learn from an anonymous employee survey, so you can kind of create your own net promoter score on your team. A lot of us forget to do this, and it's very easy for a release manager and engineering manager to make a couple of SurveyMonkey questions and say, hey team, we'd just really like to get your feedback, and measure that from time to time, release that on a certain cadence, and you can get a good indicator of are things improving over time, right? Ultimately, at the end of the day, when we talk about the cultural impact of some of these transformations, quality of life really comes up as a great outcome of some of these investments, right? Knowing that you get your weekends back, right, in the notion of a better process that's more repeatable and automatable, has fewer crises, and that means you might make it to your kid's ball game. Right? So that kind of takes me through the cultural part, the digital enterprise dashboard. I hope that didn't come across as too fuzzy, right? What I was trying to do is give you some examples of some much more concrete things that can be measured that are indicators of some of the broader business value in that space there. I'm not going to spend too much time on us here at ZB Labs. I already mentioned that we're all about doing this continuous delivery at enterprise scale. How we approach this particular problem is across our 3 products. This idea of visibility into the software release process in the enterprise is key to all of these. So XL Release, kind of helps you manage and orchestrate the overall release pipeline. We have dashboards. Those screenshots up at the beginning came from the XL Release product that are really focused on helping to surface some of this data, regardless of the external tools that you're using. It's pulling data in from Jenkins or whatever your deployment tool is. It's pulling information in from ServiceNow or Jira and consolidating all that into a single view. XL Deploy, our deployment automation and release automation tool for the enterprise. Likewise, we surface all of the data about that through a dashboard. With all of these products too, one thing that I find most helpful about them isn't just a kind of dial of how are we doing, but one part of the XL Release dashboard is what percentage of my process has been automated, which can be really helpful for you to say, hey, if I look at our process today, 3/4 of our process is still manual, and it's taking us a certain amount of time. As you automate more and more, you can see has that impacted some of these outcomes. So it's a great way for you to say to your management, by automating another 20% of our process, we were able to achieve these goals from those other metrics. Right? Feel free to come by, check out our products. We also have a couple of other assets that might be helpful. We have this book called The Manager's Guide to Continuous Delivery. It does go into some of these topics in more detail, so feel free to come there. We got a great forward in the book from Dave Farley and Jeff Sutherland as well that might be helpful for you. So. That took us up a couple more minutes past the 1/4 hour that I was hoping to aim for, but I think we still have plenty of time for some conversation and discussion. So let me pause there. I'm going to take a quick sip of my water, and I'll switch over to the questions panel to see what we have.
And while you're taking your sip of water, we do have quite a number of questions from the audience, and thank you all for participating. And I think it's a testament to your presentation, Tim, that we've got some great interaction here with the audience. Just let us know when you're ready. I know you've got the questions queued up there.
Yeah, so I'm kind of scrolling through already here. I'm going to move it. You're right. This is fantastic. I've done many webinars, and it's often tough to get folks to ask questions. So this is great. So I'm just going to kind of scroll through if I can maximize the window here, so it's a little easier to see. Hold on. So I'm just going to start grabbing some randomly here. So here's an interesting one. So if your organization is very immature, right, and cycle times are really long, they're months, would you recommend other metrics to help drive? So things like percentage of tests automated or percentage of deployments that are scripted. Yeah, absolutely. So I think that one of what's automated versus what's manual is really helpful in those cases because that's your process, is to start thinking about how can we automate more of this. So that's a great one to start at. Test automation, obviously, automated testing is a key part of CD basics or fundamentals, right? So looking at those. So yeah, absolutely within these outcome metrics, so something like reducing the overall release time or increasing the frequency, those are kind of outcome-based metrics, but you're right, there are these individual supporting metrics that are important to measure that lead up to those. So increasing the amount of tests that are automated, the amount of deployments that are scripted, great. Another thing that might be there are in kind of negative outcomes, right? So time to roll back or time to address specific tasks within response to challenges, right? So that's a great question. Let's see. So here's a good one. So shouldn't cost to recover also be an important metric? For example, impact on customer loyalty. Yeah, this is a great one. So there are depending on the kind of product you use, you may have a more or less captive audience in the consumers of your software, right? So it is important to say that there are kinds of problems that are more critical than others to those customers. If you have a relatively optional system and it's for internal employees that don't have other options, then you might be able to measure the impact to recover in a more casual way. Whereas if you have public-facing software that has consumers that have viable alternatives to your offering, take the bank for example, and you have a range of systems that have different importance. Part of your system might be to give information about products and services, whereas others might be core to the functionality of your application. In those areas, that cost to recover is going to be much more severe in the latter than it is in the former. So I think that's a great one. The cost of recovery, I think it gets a little bit challenging to figure out what exactly is the number to do that, right? So I'd love to hear some folks' thoughts on that. What are the actual numbers that you can use to measure to differentiate between more costly features to recover versus less costly features to recover, right? Regulated industries. This is a great one. What additional statistics are relevant for regulated industries like financial or pharma or so forth? Yeah, this is a great one. So this kind of starts to get into the realm of control and compliance as well. So that is a great first one. So I often talk to our customers who are in regulated industries who do have a compliance team. You absolutely have to include those compliance and security as well, security pros in that process, and allow them to build their own kind of measures into the process as well. So, being able to have sign-offs of certain stages by your compliance professionals, that can be a metric. And, you can measure percentages of times when compliance steps in your process were rejected or had to go back and push a release back to an earlier process. That's a good measure. So the number of times that compliance gates were activated is a good way to measure that. Obviously, different industries are going to have different sets of requirements. Sarbanes-Oxley, HIPAA in healthcare, and all of these different regulated industries have their own. So you may have measures that have to go in, in for that as well. Security, I will mention as another important one. So depending on what you're doing for security, you might be doing some static analysis as part of your continuous integration process. You might have a full automated analysis of dynamic and static analysis process that happens before you release. In many cases, you might release to production and then do some post-release pen testing or other manual processes that measure the quality of that software. Those are great metrics as well. I do have one customer who measures the amount of backlog space that they reserve to respond to security-related incidents, right? I know that sounds a little bit convoluted, but what they were finding was that since the security testing and analysis was happening so late in the cycle, the engineering team had to reserve engineering capacity to respond to those late-breaking findings, right? It's a highly disruptive way to deal with security, and we really encourage folks to build security in earlier in the process. But in their case, that's how they did it. And so a meaningful metric for them was shrinking that percentage. So how much, and it was basically expressed in story points, how were they over time reducing the amount of points that they had to reserve to respond to security issues. So, again, these are kind of the ways you have to think about the measurement, right? So for all of these, if there's a way you can attach a number, look at that number over time, right? So that's where it becomes meaningful, is to say, what's the trend over time? Okay, let's see some other good questions here. Scrolling. Sorry, the window's really small for me, so trying to see. Oh, okay, this is kind of interesting. So how can software teams avoid the pitfall of lazily relaxing code quality when mean time to recovery is low? Okay, so I would love to hear more about this condition. Yes, knowing that you have a low mean time to recovery should give you a little bit more confidence to know that you can respond if there's a problem, but it doesn't relieve you of the responsibility of making sure that that feature is well tested and good quality in the first place. I think from most of my experience working with developers, knowing that you can recover from a problem is probably not going to result in them saying, oh good, I don't have to have good thorough test coverage, right? And for that matter, you could actually use some of those metrics to make sure that doesn't happen. So something like code coverage is a really valuable metric here to make sure that your developers are writing tests that actually express the functionality completely enough that your tests are giving you a high degree of confidence, right? So that's a good way that you can hold the developers accountable to the quality of it, even if the outcome or responding to a problem is reduced. Right? Great. So I think it looks like we're coming up to the very end.
Yeah, we are, Tim. I apologize. We're at the top of the hour. But you know what? We do have the good thing about putting questions in the queue like this. Tim, we have a written, they'll be, all recorded. We can get you these questions, and perhaps if you have some time, if you want to post some written answers to them, we could post that along with the playback and slides of today's webinar. So,
yeah, I'd love to do that, and that would also encourage the community to keep this conversation going. I'd love to see some other folks share their experience and their results. So I'd love that. Thanks so much, Alan.
Yeah, I think, it is. It's a great way to, we do appreciate the questions and we want to get them answered. So we'll do that and we'll get on it. But as I said, we're past the top of the hour and I know everyone is busy. Tim, first of all, welcome aboard Zibia. It was a pleasure having you here on your first webinar with us. I thought you knocked it out of the park. Thank you so much. Thank you to Zibia Labs for sponsoring today's webinar. Always a great webinar from our friends at Zibia, great content. And thank you most of all to those of you who have sat in. And I hope you enjoyed the webinar. I know I did. We'll see you at another Devops.com webinar. Until then, this is Alan Schimmel for Devops.com. And on behalf of Zibia Labs, thank you and have a great day.